Hey guys, Mrs. Palmer here. We are going to launch into a new chapter, which is actually a continuation of the last chapter. We're talking about the Middle Ages. We're continuing to talk about the Middle Ages. And in chapter 14, section 1, we will talk about church reform and the Crusades, essentially when the Catholic Church underwent reform and launched the Crusades against the Muslims, which takes place over a long period of time. So come along as we explore that together. All right, so what problems was the church facing at the time? We talked about a couple of those in the last chapter, chapter 13. Remember, an ongoing power struggle between church and state, particularly over issues like lay investiture, which we talked about in the last section. Another issue was called simony, which was where people would sell very high ranking church offices to the highest bidder to raise money. And the Pope really opposed this, obviously. And so we'll talk a little bit about that later, especially actually when we get to the Protestant Reformation, because that's one of Martin Luther's big problems with the church. There was also a lack of centralized authority. Remember, the Roman Empire was a very centralized authority. It controlled a vast territory. There were consistent laws and expectations. There was a common currency, all that kind of stuff. All of that fell by the wayside during the Middle Ages, and what replaced it was more localized powers and feudalism, which was an economic and social system to try to protect people in these times of decentralization. So we'll talk a little bit more about that as well. And then also the question was raised, should priests be able to marry? Because in the church, really since the beginning, the majority of priests married, and there was no problem with that. But at a certain point in time, the church started to question, well, would priests be better off not marrying because they don't have to deal with wives at home? When are you getting home? Dinner's getting cold. The kids need you, whatever. They could focus completely and totally on their duties as a priest. And so this really was an issue raised in the West. So in the Roman Catholic Church, it became an issue, and we'll talk a little bit more about that in a minute. In the East, it wasn't perceived as a problem, and so to this day, priests still the majority of priests, and so this was one big area of division between the two churches, or between the East and the West, I should say. Also, as we talked about, when the barbarians invaded the Roman Empire, like the Germanic tribes, they were not literate, they couldn't read and write, and they did have languages, but they also had numerous dialects. So in many parts of the world, there was an inability to have a common language, or they didn't have a common language, and so this was another problem. And then finally, population decline was also an issue. This period that we're about to study is called the Age of Faith, because a new religious zeal started to develop in Europe around 1000 AD. There was a spiritual revival, and this led to a number of reforms in the church, for which the monasteries played a huge role. And so reformers at this time started to expand church power and make it stronger in Europe. So, for example, here's a picture of the Benedictine Abbey of Cluny as it looked in 2004, not in 910 when it was founded. And then this is just a symbol of the coat of arms of Cluny Abbey, just a symbol. All right, so a number of religious orders took the lead in in reforming the church. So you had, for example, the Benedictines, which were founded in Cluny, France. And then you had the Dominicans and Franciscans and a number of other orders, and even a number of new religious orders for women. The Franciscans took a vow of poverty and became mendicants. So mendicants were just people who preached the gospel and traveled, and they renounced all possessions. So they would just go out and rely upon the kindness of people to feed them. So they would kind of be perceived as kind of like beggars in the street, but not necessarily in the way that we see people now who ask for money. These guys were praying for us, and for our salvation, and played a huge role in society. And so they were not looked upon so negatively. Again, also female orders were founded as well. Okay, so the papacy also started a number of reforms. Popes Leo the Ninth and Gregory the Seventh, who we already talked about, enforced a number of reforms, and they introduced something like a court for church law. So they had advisors called the curia to settle matters of the church and to enforce canon law, so church laws. And it was in the 12th century that the Catholic Church started requiring celibacy for priests. So understand, again, in the early 1100s, that was when papal celibacy began in the Catholic Church. But it did not begin in the East. It remained where priests would marry and have families. Popes Leo the Ninth and Gregory the Seventh also addressed the issue of simony, the buying and selling of church offices, and they also make sure that tithes go to care for the sick and the poor. Ironically, as you can see from this, peasants are paying tithes in the 17th century portrait. And so ironically, it was often the poor that had to pay the tithe money to support the poor, whereas a lot of rich people in certain parts of the world, especially in France with the various estates, it was the wealthy people and the upper clergymen who didn't have to pay taxes, and it was the commoners who did. So one of the ironies of life. All right, cathedrals. The early cathedrals were built in something called the Romanesque style, as you can see kind of like from these pictures. And these style cathedrals had very thick walls. Sorry, my dogs are wrestling. So they had very thick walls and pillars. They were very dark. They had very small windows, so it was very dark inside. They had very rounded arches, as you can see here, and they were built kind of like the older Roman style, which is why they're called Romanesque. But a new type or style of church architecture started beginning around 1100 in Europe, and this was called Gothic. Gothic churches, in contrast, had very large and tall windows which let in a lot of light, and incidentally, the term Gothic comes from the word Goth, right? Which was one of the Germanic tribes that invaded. So that's just where the term came from. But basically, the Gothic style has large, tall windows that let in more light. They had pointed arches, stained glass windows, lots of sculptures. And again, this idea, as you can see here, of these very tall spires, this idea that when you enter into a cathedral or you're standing outside and observing it, it is reaching towards heaven. And so the cathedral was essentially viewed as the city of God. They had something called flying buttresses to try to hold up these massive structures with thinner walls, and the stained glass told stories, but it shows you the ribbed vaults, the flying buttresses, the pointed arches, and the tall spires. So again, all of this to indicate that you're looking toward heaven. The other thing is that's notable about the Gothic churches is that they have a traditional floor plan, which is essentially in the shape of a cross. You have the narthex, the nave, the transepts, a little chapel, the chancel, and the apse facing east.